that sometimes people just don't know what IT does. I think IT is perceived as a break fix function where you're just kind of sitting in the corner until someone's like, hey, my laptop isn't booting, or this thing doesn't let me log in. Can you help me? But how do you elevate yourself and the function beyond that to be seen as essentially a technical business partner where they're comfortable coming to you with more high level problems that they can rely on you to solve?
Welcome to All Aboard, a podcast brought to you by Conductor One. All Aboard is a show designed to equip security and IT pros with the knowledge, tools, and practical advice to keep their teams secure and productive. In each episode, we'll be joined by industry leaders, experts, and innovators. They'll share their tips and insights for tackling the toughest problems facing IT and security teams today. So, sit back, relax, and join us on the ride. All aboard.
I'm your host, Alex Bovey, CEO and co-founder at Conductor One. In this episode, I'm excited to speak with Ylan Muller. Ylan is the senior IT manager at FireHydrant, an incident management automation platform for DevOps and engineering teams. With over a decade of experience in information technology at high-growth tech companies, Ylan has seen it all. She's worked as a part of the IT team at a late-stage tech company and has been the first IT hire at a startup where she ran the whole show. In this episode, she shares some of the similarities and differences between those experiences. We also dive into the KPIs she uses to measure success and advice for balancing productivity and security in a remote-first workforce. You won't want to miss this. Let's dive right into today's show.
Well, Ylan, thanks for taking the time to join me today. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to chatting with you about all things IT and early stage IT in particular. You know, one thing I've appreciated about your background is that you've been at, several early stage startups and even some later stage bigger companies as well. And I'm really curious because I think you must have a very unique perspective about what it takes to be successful in IT in both of those environments, and also what some of the differences are. And I was just kind of wondering, could you talk about what some of the differences are in terms of how IT functions at smaller companies, earlier stage startups versus later stage companies?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. So I find that at early stage startups, IT has a much bigger hand in how systems are implemented, what tools are brought into the company, and you tend to be a lot closer to your business partners. So if I contrast that with my experience at a later stage startup where you end up with systems analysts across multiple departments, and those people are the experts in what they want to build and the tooling they want to bring in, you end up being brought in sort of as an afterthought who is there to help them understand where IT and perhaps security's requirements are and how they fit into that broader picture of what they're trying to do in their specific business unit. Versus at early stage startups, oftentimes people are resource constrained. They have their own areas of focus, but they're not really focused on the technology behind how they want to work. And that's where you get a lot more exposure to different parts of the business. For example, on any given day, you could be helping out with 3 different departments on how they want to do certain technical implementations, which is satisfying for me. But it's also a big challenge. You have to really up-level your own understanding of how those departments operate and the tooling that's sort of best in class or what would work best for their use cases. So I find for me, at early stage startups, you end up being more of a solutions engineer, to borrow a term from the sales world, because, you are a jack of all trades. You have to know not only your tech stack up and down, but other people's tech stacks up and down and figure out how it all fits together. Versus my work at more mature company, I could spend easily 75% of my week doing just IAM policies and working on different product implementations that might also relate to identity and access and, how we want to roll something out. So in that way, you sort of lack breadth. You become more of a deep pool of knowledge versus, the trope of inch deep, mile wide you get in early stage IT.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I love, in some ways, I guess if you're attracted to the startup journey, that is the promise, right? Is like you get the opportunity to work on a lot of different things. You get to work across the entire business. And I imagine like lots of different departments solving a lot of different problems. And it's got to feel really satisfying to to just be that strategic of an operator to really help drive the business and help every single team be more effective and to achieve their goals. And at early stages, that's like, the most important, like helping the sales team hit their numbers, like the most important thing you could possibly do. And so if there's like a single jump between the sales team hitting their goal and how you help them achieve that, that's got to feel pretty awesome. That being said, I imagine that being the sort of first IT hire at a company really does come with a unique set of challenges. And I'm curious, in your experience, what do you really have to get right to be successful in that environment?
So this is the first time I've been the first IT hire at a company, so I'm going to speak from solely this one experience. But I think the biggest challenge for me was figuring out exactly what we needed to establish a strong foundation. I was really, really fortunate in that the person who was running sort of the IT function in the organization prior to me, who was splitting his time between like 50 other different jobs for the company, had a pretty good understanding of what strong baselines looked like. So I started off with, good technical, we'll say, pillars to work with, and then I can build out, the rest of the scaffolding from there. But, when you come from a larger company, a lot of those processes are already built out for you. You don't have to think about how to onboard employees, how to automate like how profile data is coming across, or how to distribute laptops because, right now they're sitting in someone's garage. Those are all problems that are solved for you already. But when you're the first in function, the real challenge is, looking back on prior experience, talking to other people in the industry and really understanding what do I have to get right so that I don't have to like think about all the basics of IT anymore and can provide more value to the business by extending myself as a helper for like the sales team, like you mentioned, or another team who is having some struggles with their tech stack. So that's problem the first. I think the second problem also is that sometimes people just don't know what IT does. I think IT is perceived as a break fix function where you're just kind of sitting in the corner until someone's like, hey, my laptop isn't booting, or this thing doesn't let me log in. Can you help me? But how do you elevate yourself and the function beyond that to be seen as essentially a technical business partner where they're comfortable coming to you with more high level problems that they can rely on you to solve? So in a sense, you sort of have to be your own marketing department as well, which is a joke I have with some other IT folks. Like you do have to do your own branding. But as far as, what you have to get right to be successful, I think really it's laying down that strong foundation I mentioned earlier. The more systems and processes that you have running on autopilot that are referenceable for you and other people so that you're not wasting mental bandwidth trying to figure out everything from scratch, the better. And it's really all the basics, like making sure you nail onboarding and offboarding, not only for compliance, but for your own team and HR's sanity, inventory management, device management, your access management process, like really get that super solid and cohesive. And then, you don't have to think about those things quite as much. And it's just running on its own without you, which is a nice place to be.
There's a lot of good themes in there that I hear pretty consistently across folks that work in IT, particularly at early stage. One being just like kind of nailing the foundations and the basics and making sure that things are running on autopilot as much as they possibly can be, because those are all just clicks and calories that you're spending then kind of doing like rote tasks on a day in and day out basis and not necessarily like adding the strategic value. And the other one that I'm kind of excited to click into maybe a little bit later is just around how much that partnership really matters with the business early on. And I mean, internal marketing is like a thing, right? I mean, it really is. It's hard and like evangelizing to the other teams how you can help them, like making your function more valuable. That's a real thing, right? And I think it's a skill set to not be underappreciated. I think because I have to imagine the best early stage IT people, it's like you're projecting yourself into the business and you're helping everyone understand how you can help them and being a partner. And as opposed to just being, sorry, this may sound like, like a pejorative, but like the team of no, like nobody wants to be that as a security or an IT leader. Like it's not fun internally. But so all that said, when you show up day one, particularly in IT, in that IT function early stage, what is it like? Because if you didn't have a sort of dedicated IT person I imagine there's a lot of like catch as catch can process. It's like things might be working a little bit. Maybe there's some documentation in Google Sheets or Word docs or whatever it is in terms of like how things work. But, is it total chaos? Is it everything was working pretty well and you're like, I just need to not break it and automate as much as possible? I'm guessing it's somewhere in between. And on that note, it's like you probably have a million priorities because the business wants a bunch of things from IT. You could automate a lot of these processes, but how do you think about spending your time and prioritizing it effectively in the most strategic way possible?
I think in my experience, when you come in as an early IT person, very rarely are things so completely broken that all hope is lost and you're just flailing around looking for what you need to do. Fortunately, most organizations these days, just because of the rise of SaaS services and compliance standards like SOC 2, if you're selling to anyone these days, you almost always have to have SOC 2 or ISO 2701 or something like that. And because of those standards and expectations from customers, you end up with early stage startups, pre-IT team having fairly good standards. There is device management in place, which was not, a given even like 7-8 years ago. They have some kind of identity and access management because that's an expectation now. So the real work for me coming in was, how do I piece these things together and figure out how they work together, because they're all SaaS products that need to be connected together with glue in some way. And how do I remove the manual labor that's going into different parts of this process? So, a good example is a lot of people still, if you're remote first, might store laptops and devices in somebody's actual house. Well, that's a point of failure. We don't want people storing laptops in their house. We want them to be able to go on vacation and things like that without having to worry about new hires and going to UPS. How do we structure it and offload that so that they don't have to worry about it at all? Those kind of become the sorts of problems that you have to solve, that and, going a layer deeper in any systems that have already been implemented to figure out, where it's configured correctly, where it's not, and getting it to your own minimum baseline as an IT professional. But as far as prioritization, I kind of stick to this like 3-point system that I've put together mentally over the years, which is, one, does this thing have material impact on revenue? So for example, if my reps can't email out without emails bouncing or going straight to spam, like that has an impact on revenue. If they can't reach prospects, that's priority number one, right? Or, they can't dial out because all their calls get misrepresented as spam. That's also an issue. Or maybe revenue is being misreported somehow, that type of thing. The next thing I look at is whether it has an impact on experience. And it's not just for customers of the company, but also my internal customers. So if I release something in the wild and I get a ticket saying, hey, my computer is super duper slow now, that's a customer experience issue, right? And that should be something that gets addressed more urgently than me, twiddling on something in the background that only benefits me and a couple of other teams, and it's sort of a nice to have. And then a question I do ask myself is, what would happen if I didn't do this sooner? So if I put this off a week, what's the impact to either myself or the business? And if the answer is nothing, then goes to the bottom of the pile, and I get to it when I have some free time, usually on a Friday afternoon where I'm like, barely anyone's online. It's time to get cracking on things that are on my to-do list that are just like fun, nice to haves. Like what is the result of me doing this sooner is the opposite way to think about that. Like, is it actually bringing value? Are people gonna, notice it?
So Friday afternoon is your Skunkworks project time. It sounds like it's a great way to do the high value but like low revenue impact maybe projects. Actually, I think that framework is like super interesting and really well structured, and probably candidly one of the best articulations I've ever heard of just how to think about spending time on systems internally, right? Which kudos to you on like that sort of like structure in terms of like how you manage your own time. I am curious though, with that internal prioritization, how do you think about if you're being successful? Because sales team if you're being successful because you got your revenue number and you hit your number, you don't hit your number. It's like immediately observable and obvious. I imagine on the IT side, it can be a little bit squishier sometimes, like you mentioned, sort of customer experience, customer satisfaction, like how slow is your computer? But, that's a very subjective measure at some level, right? It's like if it's really slow and it's a terrible experience, you'll kind of know it, but there's a lot of like gray area in between there. So I am curious how do you think about if you're being successful? Like, are you sort of KPI driven? Is it something a little bit squishier? Do you measure any of that?
It's a little of both. I do agree that it's harder to get concrete, measurable impact out of an IT team that isn't how many tickets have you responded to and how quickly are you responding to them. So for me, we have a pretty good goal setting structure at my current company. And so at the start of each year, I lay out exactly what I want to do and I make sure that there's numbers attached to it. So yes, I do have KPIs around how quickly do I respond to tickets, how quickly are they resolved, and also customer satisfaction scores for how I'm responding to them. And a lot of the things I work on do manifest as tickets, so that works well for me. But for a more project-oriented team, it might not. But as an example, not late last year, sometime last year, I wanted to start poking and prodding in other parts of the business and seeing where I could assist with projects that IT wouldn't normally have a place in, or that stakeholders wouldn't think to bring IT into until they were hitting a significant technical blocker. So a goal I had was that I wanted to be involved in at least 2 major projects on a completely different team in some abstract way, right? Maybe looking back at it now, I would have been a little more concrete in, what value I was providing in those projects. But at the time, it was just like, I just need to get my hands dirty since it was my first year at the company. And it was important to me to get to know these other business stakeholders and have an objective tied to it. So that's a way you can measure it as well. I think, yeah, the rest of it is also pretty squishy. If I deploy a certain spec of machine and I have a significant reduction in tickets, which is not really something that you normally measure, that's a good sign for me, because that means that we have specs that are either at what we need for the company or maybe a little bit over, but it's reducing the amount of bottlenecks and issues that our end users have and making them more productive, and they don't have to come to me as much for help. So those are the types of things I try to look at, but it's definitely a work in progress, and I'm very interested to see how other IT teams gauge their success in that area.
Yeah, and I can imagine it's you also have the unique opportunity to kind of observe all of those things at once as being an early stage IT person, because you have kind of that, you're not a siloed, kind of to our point earlier, you're not as siloed in it. So it's like you have an incentive to fix the performance of endpoint machines because that addresses the ticket. Whereas like maybe when you get a little bit later in IT, if those are siloed problems, it's kind of like, well, that's someone else's issue if there's like a bunch of tickets about how slow things are. Actually, kind of, it's a little bit question a little bit related to that, but it's a little bit of a shift. But I kind of want to explore your thoughts on SaaS proliferation. We recently heard a customer say, kind of use the expression, there's a SaaS for that, just in the reference to the idea that like literally any problem that you could possibly have, there's some sort of specialized SaaS that's out there, some point solution that's probably automating it or solving that problem for you in some way, shape, or form. And that's very different than, I mean, I've been in tech for a minute now, but even 10 years ago, it was like it really wasn't that. I mean, there were some SaaS companies out there, but there wasn't, just that sheer proliferation of different SaaS applications and permutations of like solving the problem in different ways. And that hits IT, obviously, from a security compliance perspective, but it's also a productivity benefit, presumably, for a lot of your users. And so I think there's a little bit of like maybe a love-hate relationship. I don't want to project that onto you. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm mostly curious on that note to get your thoughts on how you think about that trade-off of productivity associated with there's a SaaS for that movement and kind of being able to optimize and have a solution for every single problem versus the complexity of the environment that creates from an IT and security standpoint, managing that. What's your philosophy?
My general philosophy is that I am embracing SaaS because it's a necessary evil for businesses like ours, where we're not equipped to build internal tooling for everything, nor are we equipped to necessarily manage a bunch of open source tools for everything that we need to do. So in a way, I'm fortunate, and I feel fortunate in the fact that there is a robust industry of different point solutions out there. That being said, it is everywhere. I feel like what we're competing against is people seeing an ad for the latest project management tool on the side of the highway and then trying to bring it into the organization, right? Like you can drive down a street in San Francisco and see 5 different SaaS apps that your users might be trying to procure into the company because they saw it. So I do like thinking about the productivity trade-off because that's an interesting one. I think the standpoint that a lot of IT professionals come at this from is, how do I prevent people from bringing SaaS in, because it's a security risk, it's a management problem. I don't have the bandwidth to oversee and ensure that all of these different tools are meeting our baselines, which is a very fair perspective to have. But it does come with a loss on productivity to the end user as well. I think I've definitely seen people try to bring things into the organization that are against their best interests because it is already in conflict with something that we do today, but that they are not aware of, or, they haven't had the opportunity to understand where parts of our tech stack could be extended to support them. And so that's where IT as a solutions engineer comes in, because you have the broadest view of technology in your organization and can provide that insight if you have a funnel for people to request things through you. My overall way of managing SaaS is I'm a really strong proponent of reevaluating your tech stack regularly, especially when it comes down to renewals. I think consolidation is a very strong strategy. The fewer planes of information you have to manage and that your end users have to interact with, the more efficient the business is going to be. No one wants to jump between 3 different applications that all look like Google Sheets to manage their tasks, right? In an ideal world, you'd settle on one and deal with the trade-offs, because there's always going to be trade-offs no matter what you move to. And the benefit of, losing a certain set of features is that it's going to be more visible. People are going to know exactly where they need to go if they need to do project management in this example. And you have to manage a single plane for data loss prevention and security and all of the other nifty things that IT and security people like to look at when they're implementing a tool. So yeah, that's kind of how I look at it. But you do need to be careful about bringing too much SaaS sprawl in, even if you're a fan.
Yeah, too much of a good thing is always a bad thing, I guess.
Everything in moderation.
I don't know. Everything
Yeah.
in moderation, including moderation, says Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
So one of the other trends that I'm sure hit you in some way, shape, or form is just the moving to remote as like teams and companies over the last few years. And I'm assuming at your current role in FireHydrant, that's a mostly remote company. I'm not actually 100% sure, but can you talk a little bit about the security implications of that? Because I think there's this, in the previous world, everyone was in the office. You kind of, I don't know, there's just something about propinquity and being around people that was a little bit easier to just understand what tools everyone was using. And if you were a 30-person startup, 60-person startup, 100-person startup, you were still kind of in the same room in the physical space as everyone else. And so you could kind of like see what was going on without needing to inspect it deeply. But that feels like it's changed, right? Like you ship the laptop out of the garage and it goes to someone and they've got an endpoint. And how do you, managing relationships with 100 people to understand all the tools that they're using is got to be really hard at 100 people, impossible at scale. And so I guess, how do you think about that sort of like IT challenge from a security standpoint, particularly as it relates to sort of remote first culture? And I think it ties in a little bit with the SaaS adoption problem, but I'm assuming also there's kind of some unique challenges beyond that as well.
Yeah, I just got hit by a wave of nostalgia because I know that when I was at the office, I would frequently hear about people talking about various tools I had no idea about. and I could sort of interject myself into that conversation and seek to understand exactly what they were trying to do. But yeah, you're right. You don't really get that anymore in a remote first culture, which is what my current company is. We are entirely remote and we don't have our own dedicated office space and, the traditional sense of we built something out. It's in a co-working location. And this has been something that we had to manage at my previous organizations as well. There was usually a trusted headquarters, but there was also satellite offices in various places. So I kind of think about the challenge of managing remote first as being fairly similar to managing a satellite office, except now you have 100 of them. The biggest issue for me was figuring out how to trust the endpoint, because that's the gateway through which everyone is accessing your company's data. In the good old days, maybe that's not the good old days, the bad old days, you might have to deploy a thin client, like a VDI environment, because you're like, I don't trust, that whatever someone is using is trustworthy. I'm going to put them into this virtual machine, essentially, that we're hosting in our location and we know has all the appropriate features. I've kind of shifted it to be more identity focused. So since we are so heavily SaaS-based, we have everything in a centralized IDP, with the exception of a few things that are not business critical, not containing sensitive data, and we secure that. So instead of saying that the endpoint is the be-all, end-all, we say, okay, we look at, let's say 7 different indicators as you're signing into our tool, and if you don't meet those requirements, then it's a no-go, even if your endpoint is managed by our MDM, or even if it is encrypted. And we can kind of tune that back and forth, but we've sort of gotten the zero trust model. As far as SaaS, it's really been addressed by, one, interjecting myself into the procurement process for things, because we have such a strong expectation that things are either in our IDP or Google, which is behind our IDP. So they're essentially the same in that sense. We have added technical guardrails to make it so requests for new software integrating to any of those things have to go through IT. You can't connect an application that we've never heard of before to Google. It'll block you and ask you to come to IT, as an example. And frankly, I do a lot of creeping around Slack because that's the new digital headquarters, right? I'm in all the major channels. If I see someone posting a screenshot from a strange system, I might, poke around and see if I can figure out what's going on there. But a lot of it ends up being, one, technical guardrails and monitoring. Our security team is always looking at what's been connected to Google, for example. And, we get reports about things that people might be installing on their desktop. And that's how we sort of are able to react to changes in the environment. But I don't think there's ever going to be a way to completely eliminate shadow IT. There are tools out there that are seeking to do that, but I think you just have to run with, the potential risk that there is going to be stuff that you don't know about because you can't see what everyone's doing on their screen. So what's the next best thing? And that's protecting the areas you can.
I love that. I love your metaphor of Slack being the new digital water cooler. It's like the place you can go, like kind of like hang around a little bit, hear like the most recent chat, what's going on. You can do a little lurking. It is.
Yeah, I have one of those.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Because I have one of those like Slack keywords that lets me know when someone mentions a specific trigger word. So that's been helpful for me.
Yeah, and I totally hear you on the nostalgia of like just walking around the office and hearing. There was something about being in person that was so efficient for communication distribution, even just understanding the context of what was going on, where you could just hear people talking about things, and not that you were intentionally trying to listen in on conversations or anything like that, but if someone was talking about. I remember my first role in tech was I ran a data team at Lookout Mobile Security. And like part of how I was so effective is I could just hear what people were working on and the challenges of them. And I was like, I could help you solve that with this and that. And just that kind of ad hoc collaboration of just being around other people, hearing what they're working on was like really, really, really valuable. So yeah, it's interesting to hear how you've had to sort of adopt that and think about conceptually you want the same outcomes and the same ability to kind of understand what's going on, but the tactics have to be a little bit different. You don't just get them for free by like showing up to work and like overhearing conversations.
Yeah, you have to be that much more deliberate in remote first companies to get the information you need.
Yep. One of the big themes, shifting gears here, one of the big themes that we just hear consistently, and I don't know if it's because of, I don't know if we're technically in a recession right now or what's happening macroeconomically, but it seems like everyone's talking about doing more with less. And yeah, that's, presumably always been a little bit of a theme with IT in particular, because it's such an automation centric function for the company and a productivity function of the company. So the idea is like you make people more productive, so you should theoretically be able to do more with less. But it seems like everybody's talking about it now. And you even mentioned earlier kind of systems consolidation so that you can be more efficient as a team, as just an example of a tactic I think it sounds like you're using. But any hot tips on how to achieve that, very nebulous high level goal of doing more with less? And in your experience, maybe what's the, maybe this is a hot tip, but like what's the biggest opportunity for optimization that you've seen?
Yeah, all great questions. I am a big shill for iPaaS tools, so integration platforms as a service tools, especially if you're not a coder, which I'm not. I can write a few scripts here and there, but I couldn't build complex business logic to save my life in code, right? So that's where these tools come in. And if you are very SaaS focused, it's invaluable. They have a wide range and sophistication on the market. So you can go from anything as like handholdy as, well, I don't want to mention actual product names, but the orange one that everyone knows about, to more complex tools where you might have to decipher your own JSON blobs and pull data across. But the point is, it acts as glue. So I think the biggest challenge we've had with being SaaS focused is, how do I get information from point A to point B to point C in a streamlined manner? And in the manual version of this, it's I grab a CSV export from here, I manipulate it in here, and then I upload it in there, right? And an iPaaS tool largely takes care of that. You don't have to schedule time out of your day each week to do manual exports that are supposed to be scheduled and putting them into another place. So I highly recommend learning one of these tools. As far as opportunities for optimization, I talked a little bit about building strong IT foundations earlier. I want to make it so, if I'm out of band for whatever reason, the IT function continues running without me. People can still request access to stuff and get, prompt responses and access to things they need. Device collection and deployment work seamlessly. Security baselines get enforced without me looking at them. Those are the big ticket items for me starting out. Like if you think about how much time you could spend automating something, let's say it takes you 4 hours to automate one of those processes in an iPaaS tool. If you spend an hour a week doing that manually, you're buying back your time over the course of a month. So that's sort of the way I think about it. But I also like to look at areas where human error can creep in, or things that have a lot of manual steps, especially for other departments. I think within IT, we're very good at seeing areas where we're putting a little too much effort in and figuring out how to automate it. That's just kind of how IT professionals and probably engineers think as well. But that's not really the case in other areas of the business who are very used to working with, physical items or dealing with, processes that have a lot of clicks. So anything where human error can creep in, automate that away. For example, I've talked a little bit about device deployment. So we use everything in a garage. We've since offloaded that to an external warehouse that handles all of our equipment. And early on in that process, it was pretty manual. I was emailing them whenever we had a new hire come in. I was emailing them when we have someone leave. I was making sure they were manually updating our inventory and our separate inventory system. Sometimes they wouldn't get to it in time because, they're busy. We're all people. Stuff happens. And over time, I was able to fully automate that. So new hire comes in, sends an email to them automatically. Someone gets offboarded, notifies them. It all comes back into our ticketing system for tracking. We have connections to our MDM to pull, checked out devices into our inventory system so they don't have to do anything anymore. And everything becomes more accurate. Because what you don't want to end up doing is all these manual processes that work in the moment, even if they take up a lot of time, where you might be making small mistakes along the way and end up having to spend several hours auditing and fixing it every year. So if you can chip away at that through the course of automating it, then that's a perfect candidate to me. But yeah, I think I've probably been very transparent about it. But my biggest time savings have honestly been in onboarding and offboarding automations. Even if the current economic slump we're in now, where people aren't, onboarding quite as often, once you build the automation, assuming you're adjusting it as things change in your tech stack, it's there forever until you turn it off. So you're not going to lose anything by building it in, although you might prioritize stuff ahead of it. It's going to be there for you when, you get that next funding round and hiring picks up again.
And then you go gangbusters. Yeah, I also really love the idea. I don't know if this was like, I don't know if this is explicitly how you think about it, but it sounds like there's almost this personal ROI calculation you have around automation as well, where you could think about, where do I spend my time? And if I spent 6 hours automating this, like what's the payback over some period of time of my personal time that I don't have to spend doing that? I can put in the effort, but if it saves me an hour a week, it's like it's paid back in, like you said, 6 weeks, whatever the calculus is.
Yeah, I especially think about this when it's a process that's very hard to automate. I'm like, okay, focus, and you'll eventually reap the rewards. But yeah, I have a lot of fun with it overall. I've definitely automated things that don't need to be automated, but they're just like fun value adds for the company, and that's just fine as well. It's good to just get your hands dirty.
Nothing wrong with that. A little bit of extra automation never hurt anybody. Parting thought before we take off, and I do appreciate you spending the time today chatting with you. It's been really awesome. Any spicy predictions for IT or security for 2023?
Spicy predictions for IT and security. I think on the security side, we're going to see some interesting policies or we'll say standards around how we implement AI technologies in the workplace. This is already a struggle today with everyone and their uncle developing tools that have AI built in and existing things that have it built in. And I think to date, we've been fairly cavalier about it, not we as in my company, but the industry as a whole with, letting these features be built in. But I'm sort of thinking there might be a backlash or more regulation around it for security teams.
Yeah, absolutely. At a minimum, a deeper understanding and opting in as a company in using those tools, or if you have a vendor or solution that uses it, opting into using those specific capabilities. Because I totally agree. Right now, that data just gets shipped off to some other service. Who knows what's going on with it? But everyone's like excited to use these tools and kind of play with them. But I don't think, to your point, it doesn't seem like anyone really understands the implications of it yet in its entirety.
Yeah, but I will say I am very interested in where it takes us productivity wise. I don't think that the state of AI today is going to replace anyone's job, especially in the knowledge worker industry in the near term, but it may very much play into do more with less. And you may be in a situation where you have to enable these features, even if, your compliance sense might be tingling in the background saying that you shouldn't.
The struggle is real. Well, that's a great way to that's a great way to end the episode, is to say that the struggle is real between productivity and security. And I appreciate your time, Ylan. It's really great chatting with you, and thanks so much.
Yeah, it's good chatting with you as well.
Thanks for tuning in. This episode of All Aboard is brought to you by the team at Conductor One. We'd love to hear your feedback. Send us a message at allaboard@conductor1.com. Till next time.